Omething had gone very wrong when one of the most powerful men in world football looked at the biggest tournament on earth and effectively called parts of it uninteresting. Not flawed, not challenging, not in need of improvement, uninteresting. And those words detonated across international football faster than almost anyone expected, because this was not some random criticism from a television pundit. This was UEFA President Alexander Ceferin openly questioning the value of matches in FIFA's expanded 48-team World Cup, a tournament that FIFA had spent years promoting as the future of the game. What happened next was even more surprising. 13 nations pushed back together. Not clubs, not journalists, not fans. Entire football nations, many of them countries that had spent decades dreaming of reaching the World Cup in the first place. Suddenly, the argument was no longer about tournament formats. It became a fight over who football actually belongs to. And the deeper you look into that fight, the more uncomfortable it becomes. Because this was never really about a few group stage matches. It was about power. The controversy started with the expanded 2026 World Cup. For decades, the World Cup had been an exclusive club. 32 teams, limited places, massive barriers to entry. Entire regions routinely found themselves locked out before the tournament even began. FIFA's answer was expansion. 48 teams, more countries, more opportunities, more representation, more dreams kept alive. At least that was the official argument. Critics immediately saw something different. More games meant more travel, more logistical complexity, more scheduling headaches, and perhaps most importantly, more mismatches. The fear was simple. If elite football nations started facing significantly weaker opponents on the world's biggest stage, would the quality suffer? Would viewers lose interest? Would the World Cup become bloated? Those concerns never completely disappeared. They simply stayed in the background, waiting, and then Ceferin's comments dragged them back into the spotlight. Because when one of the most influential figures in European football publicly questions whether some World Cup matches are worth watching, people hear more than criticism. They hear hierarchy. They hear a ranking system. They hear somebody deciding which football nations matter and which ones don't. That's why the reaction became so fierce. For the countries pushing back, the issue wasn't just the format, it was dignity. Think about it from their perspective. Imagine your nation spends generations trying to reach a World Cup. Players sacrifice careers. Families sacrifice opportunities. Entire football federations build toward one goal. Then finally, after decades of waiting, you get your chance. And before a ball is even kicked, somebody from the sport's most powerful region suggests your matches might be uninteresting. That lands differently, very differently, because what exactly makes a football match interesting? Is it television ratings, betting markets, the number of global superstars on the field, or is it the meaning attached to the game itself? That's where this story starts becoming much larger than a disagreement between UEFA and FIFA. A 7-1 scoreline might look meaningless to someone sitting in a television studio, but it doesn't feel meaningless to the country living through it. For a debutante nation, simply hearing their anthem at a World Cup can become a defining national moment. For players who grew up believing qualification was impossible, every minute matters. For families, communities, and supporters, those matches become history regardless of the result. And suddenly the definition of interesting starts looking very different. But here's where things get complicated, because UEFA's concerns didn't appear from nowhere. There is a genuine argument underneath all this, an argument many people quietly agree with. European football sits at the center of the game's economic engine. The biggest clubs, the biggest television deals, the biggest sponsorships, the biggest audiences. From that perspective, quality matters. Competitive balance matters. Nobody wants group stages filled with predictable outcomes. Nobody wants matches that feel decided before kickoff. Nobody wants a tournament stretched so far that intensity disappears. Those concerns are real. The problem is what happens when those concerns collide with the idea that football should be open to everyone, because those two visions are becoming increasingly difficult to reconcile. One vision sees football as a premium product, the other sees football as a global right, and right now, FIFA and UEFA appear to be standing on opposite sides of that divide. The tension becomes even clearer when you look beyond the matches themselves, because the expanded World Cup isn't only creating sporting questions, it's creating commercial questions too. Questions nobody seems eager to discuss publicly. More teams means more venues. More venues mean more operational costs. More operational costs mean greater pressure to maximize revenue. Then suddenly issues like ticket pricing become part of the conversation. Travel costs become part of the conversation. Attendance concerns become part of the conversation. The entire tournament starts carrying a different economic weight. And that's when another uncomfortable possibility emerges. What if the debate isn't really about football quality at all? What What if quality is simply the most acceptable public argument? Because behind every discussion about tournament standards sits another discussion about money, about marketability, about commercial value, about which matches attract advertisers, about which countries attract viewers, about which stories generate revenue. Nobody likes saying that part out loud, but it hovers over every major football decision, and the timing of this dispute only made those suspicions stronger, because FIFA has spent years presenting expansion as proof that football is becoming more inclusive, more democratic, more representative. Meanwhile, many traditional power centers remain unconvinced, not necessarily because they oppose inclusion, but because inclusion changes influence. The more nations involved, the more voices matter. The more voices matter, the harder it becomes for established powers to shape the future. That's where this argument starts looking less like a sporting disagreement and more like a political struggle, a struggle over control. And football has seen this pattern before, again and again. Every major reform eventually creates winners and losers. Every expansion shifts influence somewhere. Every new opportunity comes at somebody else's expense. The World Cup is no different. What's fascinating is how quickly public opinion began splitting into camps. One side looked at the criticism and saw arrogance, the belief that football's elite were trying to protect their status. The other side looked at the expansion and saw dilution, a tournament becoming bigger at the expense of becoming better. Both sides believed they were defending football. That's what made the confrontation so powerful. Neither side saw themselves as the villain, and when that happens, compromise becomes much harder. Then another question emerged. What if the expanded World Cup actually works? What if one of these so-called uninteresting teams produces a historic upset? What if a debutante nation captures the imagination of millions? What if the tournament creates stories that never could have existed under the old format? Because football history is full of moments nobody expected. That's the sport's greatest strength, its unpredictability, its ability to embarrass experts, its ability to make certainty look foolish. The irony is impossible to ignore. The very nations being dismissed today could become the tournament's biggest story tomorrow, and if that happens, the entire argument changes overnight. But there is also a counter-argument that refuses to disappear. What if the critics are right? What if the expanded group stage produces too many one-sided matches? What if viewers tune out? What if competitive intensity genuinely suffers? Those possibilities exist too. Which is why this controversy remains unresolved. Nobody actually knows what the final verdict will be. Not yet. The tournament itself will decide, the matches will decide, the players will decide. And that uncertainty is exactly what makes this battle so significant. Because underneath every statement, every rebuttal, every public disagreement sits a deeper question. Who owns the World Cup? Is it the strongest football nations? The richest football nations? The most successful football institutions? Or is it everybody? That question has no easy answer, and that's why Ceferin's comments created such a reaction. The words touched a fault line that was already there, a fault line between exclusivity and inclusion, between prestige and participation, between product and identity. What looked like a simple criticism suddenly became a referendum on the future of the sport, and that's why FIFA finds itself in such a fascinating position. The organization doesn't merely need the expanded World Cup to function, it needs it to succeed, because if the tournament delivers unforgettable moments, the expansion gains legitimacy, the critics lose leverage, the debate shifts. But if the tournament struggles, every warning suddenly looks prophetic, every concern gains credibility, every criticism becomes harder to dismiss, which means the real battle hasn't happened yet. The real battle begins when the first whistle blows, when the debutantes step onto the field, when the underdogs face the giants, when the world discovers whether these matches are truly uninteresting, or whether football's most powerful institutions have completely misunderstood what makes the World Cup special in the first place. Because in the end, this was never about 48 teams. It was never about scheduling. It was never about logistics. It was never even about one controversial quote. It was about a question that football still cannot answer. Is the World Cup supposed to be the best collection of teams in the world? Or is it supposed to be the world itself? And until that question is settled, the conflict between UEFA and FIFA isn't going away. If anything, it's only just beginning.